The rain fell heavily over the city, turning the streets below into rivers of reflected neon light. From the 23rd floor of the Justice Building, Prosecutor Adrian Reyes stood alone in his office, staring through the rain-streaked glass. Most of the lights in the building had already been switched off. Secretaries had gone home hours ago, and even the security guards made their rounds quietly, careful not to disturb the prosecutor, known for working long after everyone else had left. Adrian's office looked more like an investigation headquarters than a workplace. Stacks of case files covered every available surface. Photographs were pinned across a large evidence board. Financial reports, witness statements, and maps filled multiple shelves. At the center of everything was one name that had consumed nearly 7 years of Adrian's life: Luca Moretti. The feared Mafia boss had become the city's most untouchable criminal. Businesses paid him protection money. Politicians accepted his donations. Police officers looked the other way whenever his name appeared in reports. Every attempt to bring him to justice had failed. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence vanished. Judges suddenly recused themselves from cases. Yet Adrian refused to give up. Many people questioned why he was so obsessed with taking down one man when countless other criminals operated throughout the city. Adrian never bothered explaining. To him, Luca Moretti represented everything wrong with the system he had sworn to protect. If someone like Luca could manipulate laws by influence and escape punishment year after year, then justice itself became meaningless. Tonight, however, something felt different. Spread across his desk were documents recently obtained from a confidential informant, whose identity was known only to Adrian. The files contained records of suspicious financial transactions, encrypted communications between public officials, and ownership documents connecting multiple shell companies to organized crime activities. Adrian had spent the last 6 hours reviewing every page. The deeper he investigated, the more shocking the connections became. For the first time in years, he could almost see the possibility of victory. Adrian lowered himself into his chair and rubbed his tired eyes before returning to the documents. The evidence appeared stronger than anything he had ever collected against the Moretti organization. Several bank transfers linked offshore accounts directly to businesses known to operate under Luca's influence. Recorded conversations hinted at bribery involving senior government officials. There were even references to meetings attended by individuals long suspected of coordinating criminal operations throughout the city. Adrian's heart raced as he highlighted another section of text. If authenticated, these documents could justify a series of arrests that would shake the city to its foundations. He glanced at the digital clock on his desk. It was already 11:47 p.m. He should have gone home hours ago. But excitement kept sleep far from his mind. Tomorrow morning he planned to present the evidence to a special anti-corruption task force. After years of frustration and dead ends, he finally possessed something substantial, something real. His coffee had gone cold, yet he barely noticed. Instead, he reached for another file and continued reading. Outside, Thunder rumbled across the skyline. The storm seemed to mirror the tension building inside him. Adrian knew that if the evidence was genuine, powerful people would do everything possible to stop him. He also knew that once he submitted the files, there would be no turning back. The investigation would become public, and every enemy connected to Luca Moretti would immediately know who was responsible. The risk didn't matter. Adrian had accepted long ago that pursuing justice carried consequences. He closed one folder and opened another, unaware that events had already begun unfolding elsewhere in the city. While he prepared for what he believed would be the biggest case of his career, dangerous forces were quietly moving into position. By the time the sun rose, his life would be far more complicated than he could possibly imagine. Several kilometers away, high above the city streets, Luca Moretti sat in a private lounge occupying the top floor of one of his luxury towers. Unlike Adrian's crowded office, the room was elegant and perfectly organized. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the storm-covered skyline. Soft jazz music drifted through hidden speakers, while city lights shimmered beneath the rain. Luca sat comfortably in a leather chair, dressed in a black tailored suit that looked as though it had been made specifically for him. A glass of whiskey rested beside him as he listened to a report from one of his most trusted advisors. The older man appeared uneasy, choosing his words carefully. "Our contacts inside the courthouse have confirmed unusual activity," he said. "Prosecutor Adrian Reyes has obtained new information. Whatever he found, he believes it's important enough to present to a special task force tomorrow." Luca remained silent for several moments. His expression revealed little, but his eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of Adrian's name. He had followed the prosecutor's efforts for years. Unlike many officials who eventually accepted bribes or political pressure, Adrian had remained stubbornly committed to his mission. It was a quality Luca found both irritating and strangely admirable. "Do we know the source?" Luca finally asked. The advisor shook his head. "No. Our people are still investigating." Luca slowly lifted his glass. "Then find out before sunrise." The advisor nodded immediately. Before the conversation could continue, another associate entered the lounge carrying urgent information. A rival syndicate had moved several armed teams into the city during the past 48 hours. Their purpose remained unclear, but intelligence reports suggested preparations for a major operation. For the first time that evening, Luca frowned. Something about the timing bothered him. Adrian discovers powerful evidence. A rival organization suddenly increases its presence. None of it felt like coincidence. Somewhere in the darkness, unseen players were preparing a move. And Luca had the uncomfortable feeling that both he and the prosecutor were about to become targets in a much larger game. The next morning began like any other. But Adrian Reyes couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sky remained gray from the previous night's storm, and a cold wind swept through the city streets as he exited the Justice Building after an early meeting with the Special Task Force. The evidence had been submitted successfully. Several officials were already preparing warrants and launching internal Investigations based on the information Adrian had provided. For the first time in years, he felt cautiously hopeful. Yet that hope came with unease. During the meeting, he had noticed unusual reactions from a few attendees. One official seemed far too nervous. Another had avoided eye contact entirely. Adrian knew corruption often spread deeper than expected. And he couldn't ignore the possibility that news of the investigation had already leaked. He kept replaying the meeting in his mind as he walked toward the underground parking garage. The normally busy area felt strangely empty. His footsteps echoed through the concrete structure while fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Adrian reached his car and stopped. Something wasn't right. The silence felt unnatural. Instinct told him to leave immediately. Before he could react, a black van screeched into the garage from a side entrance. Its tires screamed against the pavement. The side door slid open. Several masked men jumped out carrying weapons. Adrian's pulse spiked. He dove behind a nearby vehicle just as gunfire erupted through the garage. Glass shattered. Concrete chipped apart from incoming rounds. The attackers moved with military precision, clearly intending to eliminate him before he could escape. Adrian drew his service weapon and returned fire, forcing them to take cover. His heart pounded violently as he searched for an exit. He had prepared for threats, intimidation, and political pressure. But a direct assassination attempt in broad daylight was something else entirely. Whoever sent these men was desperate. And desperate enemies were the most dangerous kind. The firefight lasted less than 2 minutes, yet it felt much longer. Adrian managed to wound one attacker. But more continued advancing through the garage. He realized he was running out of options. His ammunition was limited, and the nearest exit was completely exposed. One wrong move would leave him vulnerable. Then something unexpected happened. A convoy of black luxury vehicles burst through the garage entrance. Their engines roared through the confined space. The attackers froze momentarily, confused by the sudden arrival. Doors flew open. Armed men wearing dark suits emerged with astonishing speed and discipline. Unlike the masked gunmen, these individuals moved like professionals. Within seconds, the balance of power shifted. The attackers found themselves caught between Adrian and the new arrivals. Gunfire erupted again, louder and more intense than before. Adrian watched in disbelief as the mysterious group systematically pushed the attackers back. Whoever these newcomers were, they weren't police officers. Their tactics were too precise, too coordinated. One of the masked gunmen shouted an order before retreating toward the van. The others followed. Within moments, the surviving attackers escaped, disappearing into the city streets. Silence gradually returned to the garage. Adrian remained behind cover, breathing heavily. Then he saw a familiar figure step out from one of the black vehicles. A tall man dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit walked calmly across the concrete floor. Despite the chaos surrounding him, his dark hair was perfectly styled. His expression remained unreadable. Adrian immediately recognized him from countless photographs and surveillance reports. Luca Moretti. The very men he had dedicated years to bringing down. Their eyes met across the damaged garage. Neither spoke at first. Adrian couldn't understand what he was seeing. Why would Luca Moretti intervene during an assassination attempt? Why would a mafia boss save the prosecutor trying to destroy him? Nothing about the situation made sense. Luca stopped several meters away while his security team secured the area. His gaze briefly examined the bullet holes scattered across nearby vehicles before returning to Adrian. "You're injured," Luca said calmly. Adrian glanced down and noticed blood on his sleeve. During the attack, a bullet had grazed his upper arm. The wound wasn't fatal, but it was bleeding steadily. "I can take care of myself," Adrian replied sharply. Luca almost smiled. If that were true, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Adrian tightened his grip on his weapon. Every instinct told him not to trust the men standing before him. Yet another part of him couldn't ignore reality. Without Luca's intervention, he might already be dead. "Why are you here?" Adrian demanded. Luca's expression darkened slightly. "Because whoever tried to kill you today wasn't working. Alone." Adrian frowned. "What does that mean?" Before Luca could answer, one of his guards approached carrying urgent news. Several additional armed vehicles had been spotted moving toward the garage. More attackers. Luca immediately turned toward his security chief. "Get him out of here." Adrian's eyes widened. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Another burst of distant gunfire echoed from outside. Luca looked back at him. For the first time, his voice carried genuine urgency. "You can argue with me later, prosecutor. Right now someone wants us both dead." The words hung heavily between them. Adrian hated the idea of trusting Luca. He hated needing help from the very men he considered his enemy. But as sirens and gunshots grew louder beyond the garage walls, he realized he had little choice. Somewhere in the city, a dangerous conspiracy was unfolding. And somehow, against all logic, the only person standing between him and death was Luca Moretti. The armored SUV sped through the city while rain hammered against the windows. Adrian Reyes sat in the back seat, his injured arm wrapped in a temporary bandage, every muscle in his body tense. Across from him sat Luca Moretti, calm as ever despite the chaos they had just escaped. Neither man had spoken for nearly 15 minutes. Adrian spent the silence studying the mafia boss he had hunted for years. Luca looked nothing like the ruthless criminal described in police reports. He wasn't shouting orders or celebrating violence. Instead, he sat quietly, reviewing information on a tablet while occasionally speaking with his security team through an earpiece. It only made Adrian more suspicious. Men like Luca built their reputations on carefully crafted images. The calm exterior meant nothing. "Where are you taking me?" Adrian finally asked. Luca looked up from the screen. "Somewhere safe." Adrian laughed bitterly. "A mafia hideout is your definition of safe." Luca closed the tablet. "The people who attacked you today knew exactly where you would be and exactly when you'd be there. That means they had information from inside the task force or the courthouse. Until we know who leaked your movements, nowhere connected to your office is safe." Adrian hated that the explanation made sense. The attack had been too precise to be random. Someone with access to confidential information had betrayed him. Yet accepting Luca's logic felt dangerously close to trusting him. "You still haven't answered my question," Adrian said. "Why save me?" Luca held his gaze for several seconds. "Because if someone is trying to kill the city's most stubborn prosecutor, I want to know why." Adrian frowned. It wasn't a real answer. Before he could press further, the SUV turned through a set of massive iron gates. Ahead stood an enormous estate overlooking the sea. Security cameras covered every angle of the property. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Adrian immediately recognized it from surveillance photographs. This was Luca Moretti's private residence, the heart of his empire. As the gates closed behind them, Adrian felt an uncomfortable realization settle in his chest. He had spent years trying to infiltrate Luca's world. Now he was entering it willingly. The mansion was even larger than Adrian expected. Marble floors stretched through grand hallways illuminated by crystal chandeliers. Expensive artwork decorated the walls. Staff members moved quietly through the residence, carefully avoiding eye contact. Everything reflected wealth, power, and control. Adrian followed Luca through several corridors before they entered a private medical suite. A doctor immediately began examining his injured arm. The bullet had only grazed him, but the wound still required proper treatment. Adrian sat silently while the doctor worked. Once the bandage was replaced, the physician left the room, leaving Adrian and Luca alone. The tension returned instantly. "You're keeping me prisoner," Adrian said. Luca leaned against a nearby desk. "If I were keeping you prisoner, your phone would be gone and guards would be standing outside the door." Adrian checked his pocket. His phone was still there. That only confused him more. "Then why bring me here?" Luca walked toward one of the windows overlooking the ocean. "Because I believe today's attack was connected to something bigger than either of us." Adrian crossed his arms. "Convenient explanation." Luca sighed. "You really think I organized that attack?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. For years, he would have said yes without hesitation. Now he wasn't certain. The attackers had seemed determined to kill him. If Luca wanted Adrian dead, allowing those men to finish the job would have been much easier than staging a rescue. Luca turned back toward him. "The men who attacked you belong to a rival organization known as the Valente Syndicate. They've been expanding aggressively during the past 6 months. Recently, they began targeting people connected to both law enforcement and organized crime." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "Why would they target you?" A shadow crossed Luca's expression. "Because I'm standing in their way." The answer raised more questions than it solved. But before Adrian could ask another, one of Luca's security officers entered carrying a folder. The man's face was unusually serious. "We found something," he said. "You need to see this immediately." The security officer placed several photographs on the table. Adrian stepped closer. The moment he saw them, his stomach tightened. The images showed meetings between prominent politicians, business leaders, and known members of the Valente Syndicate. Some of the faces were familiar. One belonged to a senior government official who had attended the task force meeting earlier that morning. Another was a respected businessman frequently praised in the media. Adrian stared at the evidence in disbelief. "Where did these come from?" he asked. "Our intelligence network," Luca replied. Adrian looked up sharply. "You've been spying on government officials?" Luca raised an eyebrow. "You're surprised a mafia boss gathers information?" Adrian wanted to argue, but the photographs were impossible to ignore. If they were genuine, corruption had spread far deeper than he imagined. The same people responsible for protecting the city might be helping destroy it. Luca placed another document in front of him. It contained details about the attack in the parking garage, vehicle registrations, financial records, communications intercepted hours before the assassination attempt. The information pointed toward a coordinated operation involving multiple powerful groups. Adrian slowly realized the attack hadn't been about silencing a prosecutor. It had been about protecting a much larger conspiracy. "Why show me this?" he asked quietly. Luca studied him for a moment. "Because you're one of the few people left who still believes the truth matters." The unexpected sincerity in his voice caught Adrian off guard. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about Luca Moretti. The man before him was still dangerous, still powerful, still connected to countless crimes. Yet something didn't fit the image Adrian had spent years building in his mind. Outside, thunder rolled across the ocean as another storm approached. Inside the mansion, an uneasy alliance was beginning to form. Neither man trusted the other. Neither wanted to work together. But both were starting to understand the same terrifying truth. Someone far more dangerous than either of them had declared war. And survival might depend on cooperation. Adrian barely slept that night. The guest room assigned to him was larger than his entire apartment. Yet comfort remained impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, images from the previous day replayed in his mind: the gunfire in the parking garage, the masked attackers, and the photographs revealing powerful officials meeting with members of the Valente syndicate. By dawn, he had reached only one conclusion. Someone had carefully constructed a web of corruption that stretched across the city. And he had only seen a fraction of it. Unable to rest, Adrian left the room and wandered through the mansion's quiet hallways. Most of the staff had not yet started their duties. The estate felt strangely peaceful, almost normal, which only made it more unsettling. This was the headquarters of one of the most feared criminal organizations in the country. Yet it looked more like a luxury hotel than a fortress. Eventually, Adrian found himself standing outside a study with its door partially open. Inside, Luca sat alone at a large desk covered with reports and maps. Unlike the polished public image Adrian knew from photographs, Luca looked tired. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and several untouched cups of coffee sat nearby. It appeared he had been working through the night. Luca glanced up as Adrian entered. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. Adrian folded his arms. "I could ask you the same question." Luca almost smiled. Before returning to the documents, Adrian's attention shifted to the maps spread across the desk. Several locations throughout the city had been marked in red. Warehouses, shipping docks, abandoned factories, and private compounds. Some were already familiar from previous investigations. Others were completely new. "What are these?" Adrian asked. Luca hesitated before answering. "Places connected to the Valente syndicate." Adrian looked closer. The markings covered far more territory than expected. The rival organization had expanded aggressively without attracting significant law enforcement attention. Either they were extremely skilled at hiding their activities, or someone inside the system was protecting them. Neither possibility was reassuring. For the first time, Adrian began to understand why. Luca seemed genuinely concerned about the syndicate's movements. Later that morning, Luca escorted Adrian to a secure operations room located beneath the mansion. The underground facility looked more advanced than some government intelligence centers Adrian had visited. Large screens displayed surveillance feeds from across the city. Analysts worked at computer stations reviewing reports and monitoring communications. Adrian struggled to hide his surprise. He had expected a criminal headquarters. Instead, he found something resembling a private intelligence agency. Luca noticed his reaction. Disappointed, he asked. Adrian ignored the comment. One of the analysts approached carrying a tablet. "We've decrypted part of the communication. Recovered from yesterday's attackers," she reported. Luca motioned for her to continue. "The orders came through multiple intermediaries, but all roads eventually lead back to the Valente syndicate." Adrian wasn't surprised. What shocked him was the next piece of information. The analyst displayed several financial records showing enormous sums of money moving through offshore accounts connected to government, contractors, and charitable organizations. "This isn't ordinary organized crime," Adrian muttered while studying the figures. The amounts involved were staggering. Luca nodded. "The syndicate isn't just buying influence. They're buying institutions." Another screen displayed photographs of missing persons collected over the past 2 years. Adrian felt his stomach tighten again. Many of the cases had received little media attention. Some victims had simply disappeared without explanation. "What does this have to do with the syndicate?" he asked quietly. The room fell silent. Luca's expression hardened. "Everything." He explained that intelligence gathered over several months suggested the Valente organization was involved in trafficking operations extending beyond the country's borders. People weren't merely disappearing. They were being sold. Adrian felt a wave of anger rise inside him. He had spent years investigating corruption and organized crime. But this was something even darker. Suddenly, the attempted assassination made more sense. If the syndicate was protecting a network of this scale, eliminating obstacles would become a priority, including prosecutors who got too close to the truth. That evening, Adrian stood alone on a balcony overlooking the ocean while processing everything he had learned. The cool sea breeze offered little comfort. The world he thought he understood was rapidly changing. For years, He believed Luca Moretti represented the greatest criminal threat facing the city. Now evidence suggested a far larger enemy was operating in the shadows. The realization unsettled him. A sliding door opened behind him. Luca stepped onto the balcony carrying 2 cups of coffee. Without speaking, he handed one to Adrian. For several moments, they stood side by side in silence, watching waves crash against the cliffs below. "You hate me," Luca said eventually. Adrian didn't deny it. "I've spent 7 years trying to put you in prison." Luca nodded as if he expected the answer. "And yet here you are." Adrian stared out at the dark horizon. "I still don't trust you." "Good," Luca replied. "Trust gets people killed." The response surprised him. It wasn't the arrogant answer he anticipated. After a pause, Adrian asked the question that had been bothering him all day. "Why are you really fighting the Valente syndicate?" Luca's expression became unreadable. For the first time since they met, he seemed reluctant to answer. "Because some lines should never be crossed," he said quietly. Adrian studied him carefully. There was genuine anger in his voice. Genuine disgust. Whatever Luca had done throughout his life, the trafficking operation appeared to violate even his own code. The realization complicated everything. It would have been easier if Luca were simply a monster. Easier if hatred remained simple. Instead, Adrian found himself confronting an uncomfortable truth. People were rarely as straightforward as he wanted them to be. Somewhere beyond the ocean, lightning illuminated the clouds. Another storm was approaching. And with every new secret uncovered, Adrian felt himself being pulled deeper into a conflict far larger than his original investigation. Whether he liked it or not, Luca Moretti was becoming less of an enemy and more of an ally. That possibility frightened him more than any gunman ever could. 3 days passed without another attack. But neither Adrian nor Luca believed the danger had disappeared. If anything, the silence felt more threatening. Powerful enemies rarely struck twice in the same way. They adapted, observed, and waited for the perfect opportunity. Adrian spent most of his time inside the underground operations center, reviewing intelligence reports and cross-checking information with records from his own investigations. The deeper he dug, the more disturbing the truth became. Corruption had infected every level of the city. Politicians, police commanders, judges, and business leaders all appeared connected through a network of money, influence, and fear. Yet one mystery continued to bother him. The Valente syndicate seemed to know too much. Every time Luca's organization made progress, the syndicate somehow learned about it. Operations failed. Informants vanished. Evidence disappeared before it could be secured. Someone inside Luca's inner circle was leaking information. Adrian stared at a wall-sized display showing the timeline of recent events. The pattern was impossible to ignore. "You have a traitor," he finally said. Several members of Luca's security team exchanged uneasy glances. Luca remained silent for a moment before nodding. "I've reached the same conclusion." Adrian frowned. "Then why haven't you done anything?" Luca looked directly at him. "Because accusing the wrong person would destroy everything." The answer carried more weight than Adrian expected. Trust was rare in Luca's world. A false accusation could create panic, division, and chaos. But waiting too long carried its own risks. Somewhere inside the organization, someone was feeding information to their enemies. And that person had already helped orchestrate an assassination attempt. The realization sent a chill through the room. Whoever the traitor was, they were close enough to access sensitive information and trusted enough to avoid suspicion. In other words, the most dangerous enemy might already be inside the mansion. That evening, Luca hosted a private strategy meeting attended by only a handful of his most trusted people. Adrian remained skeptical about being included, but Luca insisted. If someone is leaking information, I want another perspective, he explained. Around the table sat security chiefs, financial advisors, and senior lieutenants who had worked with Luca for years. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew a traitor might be present. Reports were reviewed. Surveillance footage was analyzed. Financial records were examined. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Then Adrian noticed something. One of the operation reports contained a timestamp that didn't match the official schedule. It was a small discrepancy, easy to overlook. But it immediately caught his attention. Wait, Adrian interrupted. This report was filed before the operation was approved. The room fell silent. Several people leaned forward to examine the document. Luca's eyes narrowed. The lieutenant responsible for the report, a man named Marco Vitali, shifted slightly in his chair. Probably a clerical error, Marco said quickly. Adrian wasn't convinced. He requested additional records. As more files were brought in, a pattern began emerging. Information connected to failed operations repeatedly passed through Marco's department. Each incident alone could be explained away. Together, they painted a very different picture. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Marco's expression remained calm, but a thin layer of sweat appeared on his forehead. Luca watched silently, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Finally, Adrian looked up from the documents. He's the leak. The words hung heavily in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Marco suddenly stood up. For a brief second, everyone froze. The next moment, he reached inside his jacket and drew a concealed handgun. Everything happened at once. Gunfire exploded through the room. Advisors dove for cover while security personnel rushed toward Marco. The traitor fired several shots before smashing through a nearby glass door and fleeing into the mansion. Alarms immediately activated throughout the estate. Red warning lights flashed across hallways as guards raced into position. Adrian and Luca joined the pursuit without hesitation. They chased Marco through a maze of corridors, down staircases, and across outdoor terraces overlooking the ocean. Despite the growing security presence, Marco seemed to know exactly where to go. It was obvious he had planned an escape route long before his betrayal was discovered. Eventually, the pursuit reached the mansion's private marina. A speedboat waited at the dock with several armed men already on board. Marco sprinted toward it. One of the gunmen opened fire to cover his escape. Adrian barely avoided a bullet that struck the concrete beside him. Before he could react, Luca grabbed his arm and pulled him behind cover. The movement was so fast that Adrian didn't fully process what happened until seconds later. Another round struck the wall where he had been standing moments before. Luca had saved his life. Again. The realization unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The gunfight intensified. Security teams exchanged fire with the escaping group while the speedboat's engines roared to life. Marco leaped aboard and shouted something unintelligible. The vessel accelerated away from the dock just as reinforcements arrived. Within seconds, it disappeared into the darkness beyond the coastline. Silence gradually returned. The traitor was gone. Worse, he would undoubtedly report everything he had learned to the Valente syndicate. Luca stared out across the ocean with a grim expression. "This changes everything," he said quietly. Adrian knew he was right. Their enemies now understood that the leak had been exposed. Any advantage they once possessed was gone. The coming conflict would no longer be fought in secret. It had become an open war. And somewhere out there, the Valente syndicate was already preparing its next move.